Committee. Today's meeting is going to focus on climate resilience. And I am having one problem. There we go. So today we're going to be joined by a leading national expert who's going to share information on the predicted serious impacts of climate change. And then we'll hear about local and regional efforts to keep up our investments in preparedness and adaptation. We'll also kick off regional efforts on our next round of climate planning under the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Climate Pollution Reduction Planning Grant being managed by COG. But before we get started with the main agenda, the first piece of committee business is to adopt the meeting summary from CEEPC's May meeting. Motions and seconds can be made verbally or in the chat box. Is there a motion to approve? I can't hear anyone right now, and if you could speak, it would be helpful.
Hi, Randy Freed here. I move to approve.
Thank you. And is there a second?
Second, this is Sarah Bagley.
Great. And are there any changes? Okay, it is approved. Thanks. Now, let me ask, are there any proposed amendments or changes to the agenda? And if not, okay, thanks. As we move to our committee and member updates, I'd like to take the prerogative as chair to highlight one very important item for this committee to undertake. As you may recall, in May, our Air and Climate Public Advisory Committee, ACPAC, sent CEEPC a letter with 9 recommendations related to various aspects of our climate agenda. The recommendations span from urging stepped-up climate action, community-wide engagement, review of existing plans and goals, adopting new, more aggressive goals, and tracking of progress. The letter we received is posted for today's meeting. So to help me advise staff on how to prioritize and address all of the recommendations in the letter, I'm going to give you all a homework assignment. Please review the letter and its recommendations. Keep in mind the various roles and responsibilities of CEEPC, COG, and our state and local members. CEEPC cannot establish policy on behalf of the Council of Governments. CEEPC can respond to requests from and make recommendations to the COG Board of Directors. In addition, the COG Board of Directors cannot set or make policy for local governments. State and local governments have that authority. CEEPC, of course, can also ask for additions or enhancements to our annual work program activities. CEEPC may also urge state and local members to consider adopting policies or instituting new programs. In that light and context, please review the letter and provide COG staff input on the following. Which points in the letter would you like to see? And please provide specifics. First, CEEPC take on a new or enhanced work program activity. CEEPC urged local members to consider adopting. COG board consideration. I'll ask staff to collate the input from this committee and make recommendations for any agenda items to consider for our September meeting. Please also note that posted on the committee website is a letter from a member of the public that urges our action on this letter. Are there any questions or initial feedback? Okay, well, we will move on then to our next bit of business, which we will get updates from committees. First, we're going to have an update from the Built Environment Energy Advisory Committee, BEAC. Chair is Andy Young, or perhaps Leah Boggs, who's going to get that report.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair Ivey. My name is Andy Young. I'm the Deputy City Manager for the City of Falls Church and Chair of the BEAC. Our last meeting was on June 20th, which primarily focused on solar implementation. As you know, last November, the COG Board endorsed a new goal of 250,000 solar rooftops in the region by 2030, with additional goals that call on local jurisdictions to pursue solar installation on government facilities and explore renewable energy for 100% of operations. So we spent a lot of time getting input from local jurisdictions on what they needed to support those goals. Some of what we heard was, number one, local governments need varied support based on their size and resources. Larger jurisdictions have more staff and funding to be able to apply for grants and participate in workshops. And smaller jurisdictions often lack these resources. Specific needs that we talked about were interconnection assistance, particularly in densely populated areas like DC, site assessments, particularly smaller jurisdictions trying to figure out where to place solar installations. Navigating programs. There's a bunch of programs out there, but I think some jurisdictions struggle with understanding and navigating all of the different programs that are available. And then finally, contracting support. So centralizing contract tools can help jurisdictions engage with vendors and manage, particularly those mid-range projects, more efficiently. We collected input from the group on what we might focus on at a COG Solar Forum. And some of the items that the group mentioned include reviews of solar programs and their requirements, detailed guidance on zoning, contracting, and technical aspects of solar projects, sharing successful strategies with other jurisdictions to help streamline implementation, strategies to assist residents and businesses, and exploring how smaller jurisdictions can partner with large ones to leverage resources and expertise. So we hope our input provides a framework to build a path towards reaching the region's goals. Feel free to reach out to the BIAC leadership, either myself, Manny Bizerto with the City of Bowie, or Al Carr with the District of Columbia, if you'd like our committee to do more on the issue. So that's all I have for you this morning. Our next meeting will be on September 19th. Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's see, next we will get an update from our Air and Climate Public Advisory Committee, ACPAC. Is Julie Kimmel going to speak, or will it be Leah Boggs?
I'm here. Thank you, Chair Ivy. As mentioned, I'm Julie Kimmel, the ACPAC Chair. I have two main updates for you today. The 2024 Climate and Energy Leadership Awards campaign closed on June 30th. We exceeded our goal this year and received 21 applications. This is the most applications we've received for the program since 2018. Judging took place at our July 15th meeting, and staff has tallied the scores and identified winners in each of the categories. And the winners will be announced and recognized at the October 9th COG board meeting. And second and last, thank you, Madam Chair, for calling attention to ACPAC's memo submitted to CEEPC back in May. As you know, ACPAC serves in an advisory capacity to CEEPC on climate and energy issues, so we take this position seriously. I've heard from many ACPAC members wondering about this committee's response to our memo. We deliberated over the recommendations and think the points put forth should be addressed. And so on behalf of the committee, I'd like to make a quick personal plea. As we mentioned in our memo, the climate crisis is the most urgent issue of our time. We can't delay even a couple of months on taking actions like the recommendations outlined in the memo, actions that we could be taking today. And as you review the memo, as Chair Ivy asked, please remember that this crisis uniquely affects children like my daughter, who is 9, and is the reason that I'm here, the reason that I applied for the committee. Children are more vulnerable to the climate impacts like extreme heat and other extreme weather than adults. They're more vulnerable to the impacts of pollution from the burning of fossil fuels, and they will experience 3 times the climate disasters that their grandparents have experienced in their lifetimes. So with all this in mind, our next meeting is in September, and we'll hope to have something from CEEPC by then. That's all I have for today. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's see, we have an update from the Regional Electric Vehicle Deployment Working Group, Virginia Burke. Are you here, or Maya Davis?
I can provide an update if she's not here.
Okay, great, thank you.
So we, the Regional Electric Vehicle Working Group, met last week to review the draft Regional Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Implementation Strategy. This draft strategy is under review by the committee, and we are asking for comments by August 7th from committee members, and we are particularly asking them to review their jurisdictional profiles. The report contains local and regional projections for EVs in communities in our region, as well as projecting needed EV infrastructure to support those EVs, and then an analysis of high priority areas for consideration by local jurisdictions. So we hope to get feedback and move to publish this strategy by the end of the summer. And then we'll bring it to you all in the fall.
Okay, great, thanks. Next, we'll have an update from the Greater Washington Region Clean Cities Coalition. Antoine Thompson.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm in a hotel,
Yes.
so.
Hear you
Okay,
perfectly.
good. Thank you, thank you. Really excited to be here with you. I'm at the Electric School Bus Summit in Baltimore, and a lot of great news since last month. A number of our school districts in the area, we were able to help them get over almost $30 million through EPA grants. I did want to mention that there is a federal application that is due tomorrow, medium and heavy duty grant program from the EPA. It's due tomorrow. If your municipality or school district is applying and you need a letter of support, please reach out to me today, and I'll make sure we add a letter of support to your application. It's a lot of money, almost $1 billion. EPA was just speaking about it at a meeting before I jumped on this call. So we really want to encourage you all to do that, to apply. The second thing third thing I wanted to also mention was just around, we are gearing up for our awards luncheon and conference that will be in Greenbelt, Maryland in October. People can nominate folks for different awards for our annual conference, and awards luncheon will be at Martin's Crosswinds on October 15th, I believe. So I'll send around an opportunity for you to recognize municipalities, fleets, businesses, individuals, and stalwarts who've been doing a phenomenal job to keep this movement alive. The last thing I wanted to mention was around workplace charging. Our office is making a full court press to really work with both the public and private sector to say, we don't just want to have charging for our fleets and for our workers. I mean, for our fleets and our vehicles, but we also need accessible charging for the public and for workers who are starting to take advantage of those $7,500 rebates to buy a new vehicle, or the $4,000 rebate to buy a used electric vehicle. People need access to charging, whether it's at work or also in public places, because more than half of the population in our region does not have a garage to charge at home. So I just wanted to share a couple of those things. Anything, as always, we can do to help the COG and all our partners. We're here to help. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you. And let's see, we need an update from our recycling committee. Is John Snar here, or the committee chair?
Thank you, Manager John Snar, staff. Just updating, we had a meeting last week of the recycling committee on enforcement. Speakers from Fairfax County and District of Columbia, both of which have been working to beef up their education and enforcement wings. Especially, common theme of what I'll mention today is the zero waste plans. More communities are either completing or in the process of writing their zero waste plan as part of a larger climate strategy. So trying to make sure that these new initiatives are actually understood and where needed and in the field when it comes to waste management is going to be more critical in the coming years. So I had a good meeting in in May. We'll have our next meeting in September, which is one of our biggest ones of the year on composting update. We just wrapped our battery management campaign, which I think I spoke about last meeting in May, in the region to educate folks about the hazards of disposing of batteries in the trash and recycling, causing fires. And then we followed that with back-to-back. We went June campaign, our usual Go Recycle campaign. This time the theme was a little different for us. I'll go ahead and see if I can share this screen here. We were, again, in keeping with the zero waste plans. I mean, one of the things that we are concerned about is how do we get to higher waste diversion, and a lot of that has to do with food and organics. So our message in June on radio, paid radio, streaming radio, digital media, paid social media was about a $60,000 media buy. And we're looking at wasted food because a lot of our waste composition studies show that as you can see hopefully in the graphic here, a third of all food is wasted and thrown out that we buy. So we're kind of encourage shopping, tips and reducing waste. And of course, an evolution of this is also some communities are beginning to roll out or experiment with pilots on curbside food composting. But before we get to that stage, it's even more important to reduce waste at the source. So we had kind of a cute campaign with wasted fruit and vegetables, as you can see here in the graphic. So I think that's all I've got for today. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, John. Let's see, we need an update from our Regional Tree Canopy Subcommittee. Michael Knapp. If he's not here, Heidi Bonifon. Are you able to give a report?
Yeah, if Heidi's on, I think, was planning on giving a report. Let me see if I can see what's going on here. Heidi,
right.
Are you able to, there you go. You're still muted.
Okay, sorry. Yes, good morning. Thank you. I wanted to say that Brian Lucatore has retired from COG after about 30 plus years of service. He had been staff lead to the Regional Tree Canopy Subcommittee, and I will be picking that up. Mike Knapp from Montgomery County is remaining on as the chair of the Regional Tree Canopy Subcommittee. And as you know, the COG board recently passed a tree canopy goal of 50% canopy for the region. And now our next step is to develop an action plan to carry that out and enforce it. So I'll be working with the Regional Tree Canopy Subcommittee. I'll be framing up the action plan and then working with them to develop that action plan by the beginning of or first quarter of next year. And then, yeah, we'll be bringing updates to you periodically about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, appreciate it. Okay, now we're going to move on to our member roundtable and staff updates. So members, now's the time for you to briefly share local updates that the group may find beneficial. Updates can be verbal or in the chat box. Do we have any updates from DC? Okay. How about from Virginia? Any updates from Virginia?
I see Randy Freed's hands up.
Okay, I can't see that right now, so if you'd help with that part, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, hi, Randy Freed. I'm on CEEPC as a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm also on the Prince William County Sustainability Commission. A couple of brief notes. Since last time we met, the Prince William County Board of County Supervisors considered a motion that would require all new data centers to be fully evaluated as opposed to having by right development. Right now, the data center overlay district allows by right development such that data centers that meet certain criteria don't even have to be approved by the Board of County Supervisors. The motion to require complete review was defeated. I know that several other jurisdictions are considering that kind of measure right now. Just to put it in context, in Prince William County, data centers could dramatically increase our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And as I've noted before, the way the standard methodology estimates greenhouse gas emissions and forecasts them sort of hides them because it considers them to be just like all other commercial buildings. So in our forecast, we estimated total emissions in 2030 to be 4.8 or 4.6 million tons of CO2 equivalent. If you provide a better estimate that doesn't sort of bury them in commercial buildings and assume that they have the same energy intensity as other commercial buildings, we're headed for more like 22 million tons, which would make it really hard to meet the regional goal of a 50% reduction by 2030. I think, in fact, that between Prince William County and Loudoun County, just those two counties alone, the increase in data center square footage is going to be enough to make it very hard to hit the regional goal. So I just kind of flag that as an issue that's worth considering as all of the other counties think about what their forecasts are and think about what kind of mitigation measures are responsible. And this is probably something that deserves consideration as we move to agenda item 3 about our climate change action plan. Okay, thank you.
No, thank you very much. And how about updates from Maryland?
Actually,
Have a-
can,
Valerie Moore from City of Alexandria, I think, has.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, missed you.
I
Go
know.
ahead.
Well, you say you don't see our hand raising. So
Well,
like,
I'm having issues with my husband's computer, but I'm grateful to have it right now, so I'm not going to complain.
got it. So I was just going to share that we have started being part of the climate budgeting cohort. This is going on with COG and ICLEI and Resource X. And I think it's a wonderful program that is allowing different departments within our city to work together, budget, financing, and then my office, the Office of Climate Action. And I just think it's great. I want to thank, actually, since Maya, you're on this call, that this is wonderful that you put this together. And we're excited and we get together. You know, sometimes you talk about projects that you do and you sort of go through it, you're doing your steps, but we actually, when we sit down and talk, we actually all are excited about it. So it is really something wonderful that our city is pursuing, and hopefully it will help us put that connection between what we budget and our climate actions with our energy, our environmental action plan together, so it moves forward. So I just wanted to share that.
Okay. So anyone else then, before I move on to Maryland, anyone else? Let's see, who's Maddie Zerdo?
No, I was just thumbs up because I'm part of that cohort.
Oh, okay. Awesome. I'm finally seeing them. So I'm like, yay, I see one. Okay, then we will move on to Maryland. Anybody in Maryland want to give a shout out? I'll take a moment of personal privilege and let you know I'm working on a bill right now that should come out in September that establishes requirements for EV charging stations in multifamily buildings and in some commercial buildings, not all. So we're working on the details of that right now. If anybody's got anything that you think I should know, please hit me up with an email. And hey, Maddie, thanks. And I would appreciate it. Council member Blagay and I found out that we were both working on similar topics at the same time. So we have joined forces on the bill, that one bill instead of two. And so, yeah, I think that's going along pretty well. Anybody else from Maryland want to chime in? Hmm? No? Okay,
This
Oh.
is
Sure.
Cindy.
Has her hand up.
okay.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everybody. This is a small contribution to greenhouse gas emissions in the region, but both the city of Tacoma Park and the county mayor of Montgomery had passed laws banning fossil fuel lawn equipment. The ban on sale took effect July 1st. The ban on use takes effect next July 1st. And in the meantime, there's an education and rebate program that the city and county are cooperating on. So if anyone is interested in that topic in Prince George's County or anywhere else, there you have it. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Any other members? And of course, COG staff. Jeff, do you have anything you'd like to update us on?
Sure. Couple things. One, you've already heard from Heidi Bonifin. She joined our team starting July 1st, and like she said, we'll be taking over some of the work on the tree canopy, but she'll also is starting in on some other things, including some work on the environmental justice toolkit. Is really looking forward to working with us. It's an interesting transition because Heidi actually was the lead staff for many years on our Chesapeake Bay Policy Committee and has now pivoted over to the climate team. So has that interesting perspective of both the water program as well as our program. So there's one sad news. We did not win our CPRG grant applications. We submitted 2 for nearly $200 million. The EPA announced its awards on Monday. Fortunately, some of our partners and friends here in the Mid-Atlantic did win awards. So, we're all in this together. Whatever emission reductions we can achieve is good for all of us. So Maryland is part of a New Jersey team, and as well as a North Carolina team. And I think Virginia is part of the North Carolina team and has won one of their own. You'll hear a bit more about that from Deb Harris under her item on the CCAP work. And I think Maya had a couple updates.
Okay. Maya?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if we can pull up the GCOM slide real quick. Thank you. All right, so in 2019, just to remind you guys, the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, or GCOM for short, recognized our region as a U.S. metro scale climate leader. And then CEEPC became a GCOM signatory, which means we would strive to meet GCOM's global best practice standards for climate planning. And as a signatory, you all committed to reducing greenhouse gases, enhancing resilience to climate change, and tracking progress transparently. As part of this, you have to, like each of these categories, we have mitigation, adaptation, energy is new. Each of those categories, inventory target plan, and then under an adaptation assessment goal plan, each of those are badges that you earn for meeting these global best practices. And for fully meeting mitigation and adaptation badges, you get that nice little compliance badge at the end saying that you fully meet these requirements. As a signatory, we report to the global platform as part of that transparent progress. We do that every couple of years. So in 2021 is after we adopted new plans and adopted new targets and developed our 2030 climate plan. We submitted and were recognized in 2021 for full compliance, meeting all the mitigation and adaptation badges. And we just have received, we reported in 2023, and so we just received confirmation that, again, we are fully compliant with the global best standards in climate planning by GCOM. This new category is energy. And I think maybe last year might have been the first time that they were asking communities to, officially report on it. We had input on this, the development of this energy badges that they now have. Basically, what it's really is though is energy equity. It's really focused on energy equity. So we did an assessment on the access of our region to secure, sustainable, and affordable energy. They look at percent of population that has access to electricity. That's really designed more for third world countries. We looked at energy consumption per capita, renewable energy capacity, source mix, and the percent of income spent on energy. And then for the target, we knew we weren't going to meet the target because this was brand new to us, that we knew they would be looking for an energy sector target. And one of them is a renewable energy target, but we reported to this, it was due prior to the COG board adopting our renewable energy regional target. But even if we tried to report to this one again, you wouldn't receive the badge unless you had a target to reduce energy poverty. They also look for goals about increasing energy efficiency, but that energy poverty target is really what they're looking for under that goal badge. For the assessment badge, we haven't received official feedback. I think they probably wanted us to do a bit more on the percent of income spent on energy. We leveraged the U.S. Department of Energy's low income energy affordability data tool, which I thought, you know, produced a lot of really robust and great results for our region. But it's like separated by DC, Maryland, Virginia, and local jurisdictions, not like a regional total. Also, this is a third-party verified process, and the reviewers are overseas. And like the last round, I know that we had to teach them a lot about federal tools. Like we had to have a lot of experts across the country talk to them about the MOVES model and how that's used in the United States by local jurisdictions to and why it's used. And so part of me is like, maybe they didn't understand the tool, or maybe they wanted something more specific out of us from that. But we did meet the energy equity concepts in our plan. So we did earn that badge. So I just wanted to let you know where we stand, as you all are the ones that signed on for us to be a signatory. I'm very happy that we are meeting all the core goals, and you know that we are striving towards the energy goals as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Now we're going to move on to item number 3, where we're going to hear from our consultant lead on the kickoff of the region's work on developing a comprehensive climate action plan under the EPA CPRG program. Deb Harris, you ready?
I am. Thank you so much. Great, and we can just jump right into the next slide, please. So we had talked about CPRG in the fall of last year and then going through into early this year. I'm just going to give a brief reminder of what the program is, talk a little bit about the awards, and then the upcoming work that we'll be doing with COG, as well as COG members and partners outside of the COG region for the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan. So just a quick refresh, CPRG provided money in 2 phases to state, local, regional governments and partners to do climate action planning in 2 phases. The Priority Climate Action Plan, which was due in March this year, and the Comprehensive Climate Plans, which are due in the middle of 2025. The total program was $5 billion, $4.3 billion just got awarded in terms of implementation grants, and the remaining money gave out to states and regions for non-competitive planning grants. So DC's allocation was the $3 million for the state, and $1 million of that got allocated to the MSA, or the regional plan, which COG is leading. The plan itself will cover the map that you can see on the right-hand side. So it is the COG region throughout Maryland, DC, and Virginia, as well as counties more west in Virginia and into West Virginia, Jefferson County as well. For the PCAP, we did not have a lot of participation from these non-COG counties, but hoping for the CCAP that we can do some additional outreach to pull them into regional climate planning. Next slide. So just a reminder on timeline of where we were and where we'll be going. So in June 29th of 23, the CPRG planning grant was awarded to DC DOEE. This is important because CCAPs are due 2 years from the date of grant award. So that would put the comprehensive climate plan due at the end of June 2025. I believe this is still being discussed with DC because all of the grants for different states and regions were signed at different times. And so some folks have their plans not due till August. So I think, well, this is an ongoing discussion about the final date, but June, July timeframe is what we're shooting for. September 2023 is when we kicked off the technical and steering committee work groups, many of which overlap with CEEPC members. And then the PCAP itself was developed between September and the end of February is when the PCAP was submitted to EPA with a due date of March 1st. The implementation grant applications were all submitted to EPA April 1st. And then again, awards were announced actually on Monday this week. So 2 days ago, I'll talk about that in a minute. And CCAPs are due summer 2025. And then there'll be a status report due to EPA in 2027. Next slide. So folks who haven't seen this, EPA has posted all of the awards on their website. Here's a geographic distribution of the awards that were given out. I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the ones that Maryland and Virginia will have access to funding for in terms of awards, but you can see a few things on here. There was a tendency to have, it looks like more coalition, state coalitions were awarded along the East Coast, and then individual applications going through kind of across the north of the country. And then there was actually quite a number of regional applications that were accepted from EPA and awarded. You can see these kind of distributed in the circles within here, and these are local or tribal. There was one tribal application that was awarded in the Sea of 25 awards that was given out. We can go to the next slide. So just a little bit more here. So 25 awards were given out. As mentioned, these go to state, local, and tribal entities. The coverage is across 30 different states in the country. About $33 billion or so of grants were submitted to EPA. So it was quite competitive in terms of the awards that were going out. EPA had initially stated they were going to award maybe about 30 to a little over 100 awards. And they were not looking to partial awards. So clearly a lot of people went in with big dollar values and they stuck with the mostly non-partial awards. And so that led to the 25. Most of the award values were quite high if you take a look at the distribution. So as Jeff mentioned earlier, both Maryland and Virginia got kind of 2 separate pots of money that they'll be working with. The first that you can see here, there's called the Clean Corridor Coalition. This is a medium heavy duty ZEV infrastructure that will be studied and implemented across the 95 corridor. So New Jersey led this one. It has Connecticut, Delaware, and Maryland. And it will include technical assistance for workforce development as well as corridor planning as well. So that total value was $250 million. The next award, which was one of the highest awards that was given out by EPA of $420 million, was a coalition led by North Carolina. A lot of push from the Nature Conservancy in there as well, called the Atlantic Conservation Coalition. This included South Carolina, Maryland, and Virginia. And it's a regional approach to natural climate solutions. So there's a number of different projects that are within here, and money is getting distributed to states as well as being managed kind of overall across the program itself. And this will include all types of natural and working lands, including coastal lands, peatlands, forest, and urban forestry. And then Virginia DEQ won an individual application of $100 million, which is focused on methane projects. So there's 3 types of projects that were in there to address methane emissions, looking at coal mine methane, which is really kind of in the southern part of the state, landfill methane emissions, so that will include addressing landfill methane through different projects throughout the state, and then a competitive grant program that's focused on methane reduction through food rescue and composting, and this is targeted at different agencies, colleges, and universities. We go to the next slide. So coming on the heels of that, we do need to do a comprehensive climate action plan. So EPA is kind of kicking off what their technical assistance forums are to provide support to planning grantees. That's really kind of ramped up. There's a planning grantee webinar tomorrow focused around CEEPC measures and requirements. And so just they'll be giving an overview of what the CEEPC requirements are. This is also listed here on the slide. A lot of these are overlapping with the PCAP, with the kind of core difference really being that the CEEPC requires measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across every sector, which the PCAP for this region covered most of. So we anticipate it'll just be kind of a revisiting of the measures to fill in any potential gaps and figure out how those kind of stack up to achieve or exceed what COG's current greenhouse gas reduction goals are. The CEEPC also requires some more extensive information to be developed. So this does require, unlike the PCAP, quantitative analysis around co-pollutant reductions, some more extensive analysis in workforce planning, thinking about potential gaps in workforce, and then more extensive engagement with stakeholders and expanding reach. So this includes low-income disadvantaged communities as well. We can go to the next slide. In terms of the CEEPC engagement that we'll be doing, this is a core piece of work that we'll be kicking off now, along with the updated analytics for the baseline projections for the region. There's a few things I wanted to point out. We do have a draft engagement plan that's been developed. This is just a very high level summary of that, where the goals are to look at building support for the CEEPC and informing stakeholders for projects and programs that might be eligible for, we'll use the term loosely, implementation funding, not just whatever CPRG money has been made available or will be made available, but other programs as well. So a core part of the CEEPC will be identifying those other funding streams that can help to implement projects. Continuing to build regional collaboration and active participation through the CEEPC. Meaningfully engaging with LIDACs, also keeping in mind what other types of outreach are going on with these different communities through other programs and initiatives, and then creating more information and awareness throughout communities. So there's a number of different tools that will be used for this. They're listed on the slide here, ranging from websites, public meetings, webinars, workshops, interviews. We'll be kicking all of that off in the coming weeks to month. I think September is really our target date for kind of ramping up the outreach and engagement. There's a number of different folks that were engaged for the PCAP. There's quite a bit that's detailed in the PCAP itself. These were different groups, universities, private industry, local governments. So we'll be targeting all of those stakeholders again and looking to expand and extend the reach of the outreach and engagement. The other thing I'll just highlight in particular, as most folks know, this program really emphasizes the LIDAC engagement component and making sure that benefits from climate actions are going to low-income disadvantaged communities. So we've done an assessment of the regional population that is a mix of using the EJ tools that the federal government provides in the COG equity emphasis areas, and looking at different indicators such as limited English proficiency, race, unemployment, income level, and education level to help drive how we're designing the engagement strategy. You can go to the next slide. Just very briefly in terms of immediate next steps, we are going through, so ICF is working with COG to go through project planning, what the schedule looks like, dates for key meetings. So working through that over the next few weeks. Finalizing the draft engagement plan. We'll be looking, I believe in September, as I mentioned, to do steering and technical committee kickoffs and kicking off the CEEPC engagement. while also focused on updating inventories and projections and revisiting the PCAP measure list as well as other COG plans that are out there, like the Transportation Climate Plan and the 2030 Action Plan, to make sure that we are hitting kind of the comprehensive suite of measures across all sectors as EPA requires. The other thing I'll just highlight is that because we are in project planning now, if there are certain topics that you would like to see the region tackle in the CCAP, or at least open discussion or continue discussion around, Jeff and I would love to hear your ideas, so feel free to email them. I know we've already gotten a few kind of popping up, like around the data center issue, things that could be addressed through this kind of not formal COG, but the CCAP planning process. So we're interested in those ideas as well. And I think with that, we could probably take any questions.
Yes. Any questions for Deb? For the COG staff? Okay. Well, let us know if you have any priorities for engagement activities related to the development of the comprehensive climate plan. Okay.
I've got a question.
Go
Randy
for
Freed here. Yeah. Hi, Deb. So will there be another round of grant applications from EPA, or having lost this round, is that our last chance?
They did this program in one and done. So it was just one round.
Right. And will MCOG get a debrief on what EPA would have liked to have seen better in case there is another round?
Yeah, we'll put in a request to get a debrief for sure. Not sure what they'll be able to share, but it's definitely a good idea. And we've already had at least one member here on the call reach out and ask if we could kind of also internally debrief and think through kind of strategically what we might want to change or do differently to see what we can do to enhance our chances on other opportunities, because I don't think we're done pursuing opportunities. There may not be another CPRG grant, but there's all sorts of other things we'll be looking at.
Yeah.
Thanks, Randy.
I'll just comment to Randy that there were a lot of very strong applications from what I've heard into EPA, and a lot of them were very high dollar value. As we saw when we went through the grant development process, it's easy to keep adding up the dollars and dollars. So I can't imagine there was a lot under the $100 million mark. So it was quite competitive, and I'm interested to hear what the EPA debrief is, because it might not necessarily be that COG didn't have strong applications. It could have been that just there were ultimately how things were graded. And then if you look at some of the applications that were awarded, they're helping to also fill in some gaps in funding that are potentially more apparent, like in some parts of the country, or projects that were driving innovation. Like I think the largest award was for the South Coast Air Quality District in Southern California, which was looking to reduce emissions across kind of a suite of transportation and buildings and electricity and fuel options focused around the port and like moving goods in a certain area, one of the largest ports in the country. So I think if you haven't and you deep dive into the awards and then you think about how many were in, I think EPA likely had a very hard time in picking some things, but certainly interested in the debrief.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no doubt, based on the list that you provided, that the actually awarded projects are pretty strong. I mean, I can really see sort of the need for that work. So stiff competition. Thank you.
And I think I see a question in the chat about the registration for the webinar tomorrow. That EPA webinar is available to EPA planning grantees, is my understanding. I don't think it's a fully open public webinar, but they will post some of the resources they talk about there on their website, the CPRG Tools and Technical Assistance website.
All right. Well, that was definitely disappointing, but we will live to fight another day, right? And next up, we're going to focus on our urgent need to consider how we address our climate resiliency in the region. We're going to hear from experts on the severe climate impacts that we are already experiencing and what we may need to plan for in the coming years and decades. And then we'll hear about how local communities are considering the cost of inaction and the need to rethink how we invest in climate adaptation and resilience. So first up, we'll hear from Ms. Sunny Westcott, a chief meteorologist with the Department of Homeland Security. And after we hear from Ms. Westcott, we're going to hear from Peter Schultz, a climate consultant with ICF. And then we'll close it out by hearing from Ms. Demetra McBride from Arlington County. So let's hear about the what can happen with inaction. Sunny Westcott.
Okay, I believe I'm sharing screen now,
Yes,
or
you
I
are.
was.
You are.
Is it still sharing? Okay, excellent. Okay, so the slide deck that I'm going to go through, I've got just about 15 minutes to go through, so I'm going to make sure that I keep it consolidated in timing. I'm going to put 2 resources into the chat. There's one on extreme heat and drought impacts to data centers, and then the other one is our extreme weather website, which touches on the main weather impacts across the different critical infrastructure sectors. So really quickly, what we're going to go through is a 101 on what's changing. I know that there's a lot of talk about it's changing in general and where it's changing, but not necessarily touching on the why aspect of it. So I'm going to go ahead and go through the slides. There's a little bit of latency on my end, just to make sure that I'm tracking that. I'm going to close down 2 of my other applications that are running just so that I don't bog down entirely during this. So what we've got going on is a change in the way that our low pressure centers move across the globe. What we have happening is that our low centers are getting deeper with the warmer air that's occurring. It's allowing for our lows to take on different attributes. So these low centers move across the continental US, always for the continental US, from the west to the east, taking some north-south variation within that. And what we end up seeing from that change in the low pressure centers is, one, a way in which they enter the US. They're typically going to enter either through the northern plains or through the Pacific Northwest, drop down along the front range of the Rocky Mountains, and then exit out to the Atlantic. So when we see a variance in temperature, we can see a variance in the intensity of the system that's brought in. What this does for us now going forward is that each one of these lows will bring with it stronger winds, heavier rainfall rates, more tornadoes per tornado day, more lightning strikes given the higher heat content that's available, as well as additional threats in the way of derechos, microbursts, straight line wind events. And then, of course, anything that happens to our continental lows can also happen to our tropical lows on the back end of these systems. So we're going to continue to monitor what's going on across the entirety of the Northern Hemisphere. It's not specific just to the continental US. This happens globally. So what we have on this slide deck is just talking about what was built and where. I live in Falls Church in a house that was built in the 70s, so I don't have insulation in my home. I had to put all of the insulation in that I have. When we look at what was built, a lot of the DMV's area metro was put in the 60s to 70s. What that means when you look at the temperature from now to what it was when they would have used climatological norms to build the infrastructure versus what we're at going forward, you can see the higher heat content across not just the mid-Atlantic, but nationally. And when you have higher heat content, you do have higher moisture fields. These go hand in hand, kind of like a sauna. It can get incredibly hot and incredibly humid, but it doesn't have to rain. So we need those low pressures to come in. And when I say that the low pressures are slowing down, they're getting stronger, what that means is we're going to see more time under high heat, high humidity content without the rainfall. By the time that we do see the rainfall, it's going to be that numerous weeks all at once occurring in singular events. So you are still going to see across many of these states their entire year's worth of rain. You're just not going to see rainy seasons. You're going to see very damaging storm events instead that are going to provide an entire season's worth of rainfall at once. So when we look at this as far as climatological abnormalities go, there are these great graphics that NOAA's NCEI team puts out that I do recommend everyone take time to look at from time to time. They update them monthly, seasonally, annually, and they go back quite a few decades. You can see here where our abnormal temperatures were not the western half of the United States, but they were instead the eastern half. Whenever you see one side of the U.S.
Did we lose you?
It doesn't have to be just the US. It could be anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere.
Hey, Sunny, we lost you for a second, just like 5
Oh,
seconds,
no.
just so you know.
Okay, so sorry about that. I don't understand where the lag is coming from. I've closed down most of the applications,
You
so
were
I do
perfect up until
apologize.
that little glitch, but go ahead.
And
Sorry,
before you
so-
go, Sunny, your maybe one thing we could do is have Tim share your slides instead of you. Maybe that'll help with your bandwidth because your slides are no longer being shared.
Yeah, they're
Okay,
going
I'll
now.
go ahead and pause. Can somebody throw up my slides? If not, I can I turn my video off and I can attempt to reshare.
There you go. Tim's
All
got
right,
it.
perfect. If we could go forward one more slide, I'll continue on. Okay, so then the slide deck here, I want to make sure we're on the correct slide. So this is just showcasing what we're going to be experiencing in the coming decades. You could just see that there's not really a positive trend that's going to end up occurring. You're going to see higher heat in the winters. We saw this last winter where we had the record break of 80 degrees in January. You're also going to see the higher precipitation amounts. These go hand in hand with these weather events. If you could go on to the next slide, you'll see here on the next one, I want to make sure, there we go. I am now matching in slide decks as well. So what we have displayed here is just the different trends of what's going to happen to our cityscapes. So the higher heat content that concrete's available to withhold, this maintains throughout the metro system because the platforms, it maintains throughout the sidewalks, the roadways, the sides of our buildings even, to be aware that all of this high latent heat that the cityscape holds onto, as well as any of the developed shopping centers, even the strip malls, these are applicable for, you'll notice that it gets hotter at night and it stays hotter. People are staying out later. They're also staying in a heightened state of aggression a lot longer because of the higher heat content available. To be aware that metal city grates, those that are exposed to direct sunlight, are also getting incredibly hot, as are seatbelt buckles, door handles, steering wheels, much like what we used to complain about for the desert Southwest, Arizona, Southern California, Texas. Shopping carts left out in direct sunlight, when we talk about heat indices over 103 degrees, those can cause burns, and they're also incredibly problematic because the concrete cement mixtures that they're sitting on are able to expand and become more malleable, subsequently taking more damage. If you go on to the next slide, this one talks about some of those impacts across our different critical infrastructure sectors. For those of you who don't know, when phones get incredibly hot, our first responders have noted this. Some of the phones are shutting off in order to prevent from battery combustion. You're also seeing that they're dropping from 5G to 4G. This becomes problematic for a variety of reasons, because this is applicable both to the phones and to some of the EVs that are left out in direct sunlight on areas like wide open parking lots. We're also seeing that some of our chemical deposit sites that are left out in high heat are seeing increased vapor rates. Any of our chemicals which are being moved along our transportation on the railways are also seeing that during the railway slowdowns, they're also under direct heat a lot longer. So to be aware, it's not just IT, it's not just the physical infrastructure, it's also all of our interdependencies that move along them. Of course, I'm sure many people have seen the recent dam breaches and overtops that have occurred not just in the New England states, but across the Great Lakes, down in Texas, across the Southeast. We are looking at the fact that many of these dams were built significantly further back, so their material break is also coming from the freeze-thaw variants that they go through. Just from the longevity of time. But the more high heat that they undergo, the more weak the material becomes. Subsequently, we're also seeing this across our emergency healthcare sectors. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see some of the other impacts that aren't necessarily always discussed. High heat has the great capability of destroying the underneath surface stability. What that allows for is, you may have seen, an increase in potholes forming. This is going to continue to be the trend. Vehicles on these hot roadways are also adding heat through friction. This is causing even more wear and tear on the roads, and underneath, as the material heats, it allows for some compression, which is allowing for more water main breaks, and these water main breaks are triggering the reduction of even more of the surface material. So you're going to see this across homes, you're going to see it across the roads, and we've already seen it across multiple different counties through the DMV area, just the increase in potholes, sinkholes in general over the last decades really going up. Extreme heat and power lines, we know that power lines sag in these higher temperatures. This is going to become a major concern as we go forward for our region because our regional materials were not built for these temperatures, unlike much of the desert Southwest, which is still seeing damage at a higher rate. They were also not built for the temperature variance that they're experiencing. So again, nobody's really got the best solution on table. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see some of the amplifications of why areas like Maryland have seen recent tornadic outbreaks. Sorry, I guess my slide deck's maybe a little bit out of order here. Transportation impacts. So we're going to shift over to that. You may have noticed that turbulence is increasing. We recently have had a couple of small aircraft down due to high heat days where the turbulence just gets too high. The variance between water and land is increased. And what we end up seeing from that is there's less lift. There's more clear air turbulence, more violent clear air turbulence at that, so stronger turbulence. You're also seeing the railways pinching that happened in the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast over the last 2 years, and then we saw it happening all the way down here in the DMV. So we're going to continue to see this impact because our rails are very dark. The UK has mitigated this by painting their railways white. This does require you to paint your railways a little bit more frequently due to the wear and tear on the material, but it does have an immediate cooling effect, and Purdue does produce a paint that reflects out 99% of solar reflectivity, thereby cooling the material that it is painted upon. You'll also notice that because the roadways are dimpling, some of the wind events are getting stronger and the storm events are getting stronger, that our higher profile vehicles are actually seeing that impact as well. So we're seeing a decrease across all of our major supply chain. If you go on to the next slide, I'm going to go slide by slide on this one then. Since my slide deck, I don't think matches the one. So this is the one I was referencing with the severe weather outbreak. So you can see where our higher heat content is yielding stronger winds. You may have noticed our winds ahead of and behind the storms are increasing in the DMV area. We're also seeing that there's more lightning strikes. We're seeing that the actual time of supercells on ground is increasing. The area where tornadic activity is expanding. It's no longer just Tornado Alley or Dixie Alley. It is now also the area in between bleeding into the mid-Atlantic, which does explain our most recent tornadic outbursts that we saw across Maryland. We've seen more tornadoes this first 6 months of this year than we typically see in an entire year on average. So we are seeing this uptick across the board. Higher hail rates as well. Hail is forming faster, which means hail from decades ago, which had air entrainment in it that would fall and break apart, is now more condensed. What this means is the dense hail is falling at anywhere between 100 and 150 miles per hour. It's done significant damage across numerous regions. Even over here in Falls Church, we had a hailstorm not too long ago that ended up doing some damage to the HVAC units that were outside. So just to be aware that these are threats that are increasing across the board as the heat content goes up. If you go on to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the amplified weather events just with the last couple of minutes. You'll see the changes in our evaporation rates are also going up, which means the rain that is coming down is evaporating out very quickly on the back end. That means the rain that we're used to seeing is not as beneficial as it once had been. So when we say things like, we really need the rain, it hasn't rained in 3 to 4 months or something along those lines, 3 to 4 weeks is currently the statement. What we see on the back end is that you get all of that rain and then it immediately gets pulled back out by direct solar radiation and these stronger winds, much like a hairdryer does. If you go on to the next slide, looking at some of the other threats that are, of course, going to be in the news as we go forward, the tropical cyclones are getting stronger. Beryl is a great example of this. Beryl produced more than 75 tornadoes across its landfall margin, but it did reach Category 5 in record break time. Last year, we saw 5 tropical cyclones in the Pacific reach what would be Category 6 intensity. We're not going to go ahead and label anything with a Category 6 because anything above a Cat 5 is already incredibly damaging across the board. So just to be aware that all of these cyclones are increasing the amount of rainfall in the first 3 hours of landfall. The winds are becoming incredibly damaging, extending a lot further out from the storm as well on both ends. So we are going to see more damage. They are also able to now carry further inland and carry further to the north in a stronger core than they have historically. So if we go on to the next slide, you'll see why this is important across the board. We may have noticed that there are more power outages. Severe weather is our lead for power outages across the nation. If severe storms are going up both in intensity and in area covered, we are going to see that these power outages will impact multiple counties at the same time. That's going to stress some of the resource allocation along with the supply chain taking a hit at the same time. So being able to restore on the back end is starting to take a lot longer in some of these areas that are hit harder, especially from lightning strikes. Again, a great example is some of the lightning most recently over by a substation where they have buried the power lines, did strike the pole that led into the buried area, thereby taking out power for an entire area for about 48 hours. this kind of damage is going to continue to increase as lightning strikes increase across the board. If you go on to the next slide, just talking about some of the different mitigation that we have. If you look at where we're seeing these lightning strikes increasing and where we're seeing these severe storms increasing, it's important to note that we have lightning protection systems that can be installed on buildings. Each building can, pick their own lightning protection system to match the size and the need of that building. So to just be aware that where we're seeing the role of the growth, that we're also seeing an increase in derecho activity. So this is going to continue to be a threat across the board. If you go on to the next slide, we're going to really quickly roll through just the last few on impacts to sites and security. So you may have noticed that our heat is going to impact our ability to do rotational staff. It's going to impact our emergency responders a lot more than it has. We also see that people are looking for resources to take on the back end of some of these disasters. So we've seen an increase in generator theft. If we're moving generators to these cell towers or to these sites, people are tracking where they're going. There's also increased aggression rates that's talked about, and of course, the impact of stress and strain on our personnel. If you go on to the next slide, we'll be going through just some of the mitigation strategies. Learning how to communicate to the communities is incredibly important, and it has been a problem that's recently been discussed with a couple of different studies on where we're seeing people not listening to messaging and why. Some of it being due to the name of a storm, some of it being that they haven't been exposed to a disaster before and not taking it seriously. So you'll just see that some of these, when you guys get the slide deck, has a bunch of different resources that link out to some of these studies so that you're able to change the way that we do our messaging to the different age groups, that we're able to do it for the people who have or have not been exposed to some of these disasters before. If you can go on to the next slide, I believe that we're closing out here. I'm not 100% sure. We're on the resiliency information. This is available through a website that CEEPC is completing this week. What it's going to do is it's going to highlight each of the main 8 weather hazards and different resiliency that each segment of the federal government highlights as a potential solution to consider. Things like painting the roads white, painting roofs white, doing green roofs, doing gray roofs, covering canals, putting in window insulation, putting in railway paint, putting in different permeable sidewalks, cooling vegetation. Those are all specific to the heat page. We also have it for wildfires, flooding, tropical cyclones, you name it, across the board. We're working on making sure that we're putting all the information into a one-stop shop as far as resiliency planning goes on the forward end of things. If you go on to the next slide, I'm going to go ahead and just let you scroll through some of these final outs. Different mitigation strategies for different storm systems. Domes are really good for wind, lightning, flood, hail, you name it. So they're a big advocation in the resiliency community. Just as we go forward on the back end of some of these storm events, if you need to set up emergency planning, domes are very good for shelters, pop-up shelters for materials or for people. If you go on to the next slide, just closing out, wildfire threats, flooding threats, sea level rise, and tropical cyclones all have overlapping benefits that if you do a mitigation strategy for one, you can usually touch on some of the benefits for others. If you put in trees, for example, it creates shade, helps with water purification, reduces the amount of wind force that comes in the area, reduces the flood force in the area, so on and so forth. On the next slide is just sea level rise planning, and then it ends on tropical cyclone resiliency. So you'll just see some of the different flood mitigations, barrier systems, putting in seagrass, all of these other secondaries that can be discussed at greater length should anybody have additional wants or needs for presentations. Again, my name is Sunny Westcott. I'm the Chief Meteorologist for Homeland Security within the CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. These slides will just be available to you guys to be able to roll through at your own pace. Pull all of the data out and use it for stakeholder engagement. All of this is available to you guys to be separated or distributed at your leisure. That's everything from me. Sorry for the issues there with technical.
Hey man, it's good. Thank you. Although that, I have to say, that was a pretty terrifying presentation. Ay, ay, ay. So in any event, continuing with our resilience theme for our last presentation today, we'll hear from Ms. Catherine Raynone about the Transportation Planning Board's work on the Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan, otherwise known as TRIP.
Hey,
Ms. Raynone?
Chair Ivy, before we go to Catherine, we have 2 other speakers. So,
Shoot, did I miss them? How did that?
Peter Schultz. Peter Schultz is up next to talk about some work that they've done looking at some of the mitigation of these impacts down in Miami. And then we're going to hear from Arlington, which has an interesting
Oh,
story
yes, you're
related
right.
to
I had said that. Thank you. I
the
said that
stormwater
earlier.
issue.
And I
Yes, and
skipped
thanks so
ahead.
much, Sunny. And one small interesting side point here that I think is pretty cool is that my daughter was in high school as part of a summer STEM program with DC Public Schools and met Miss Westcott at a particular event there where Sunny presented to all the kids about the climate. And so my daughter actually introduced me to Sunny, and hence the connection here today. So I thought that was really cool. Peter, you're up.
Awesome. Yep. Dr. Schultz, I should say.
Peter. Yeah, hey, thanks for having me. Thanks, Sunny. That was an amazing overview that you gave, Sunny. So I'm going to talk about the cost of inaction if we do nothing, which I think was kind of the title of what this 3-talk session is really focused on. And I'm going to just have 3 slides, one at the national level, one at the city level, and one at the individual level. So let's go to the first slide there. Okay. First, findings from the U.S. National Climate Assessment. This and the other 2 studies that I'm going to talk about are things that ICF has some involvement in. ICF provides the staffing to support the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which is the gold standard assessment of climate change impacts and adaptation for the United States. And it's also incorporating mitigation now into the analysis. It involves several hundred authors that develop consensus statements about climate change in the United States. Specific to the topic here, the National Climate Assessment concluded looking backward that weather-related disasters currently create at least $150 billion per year average direct damages to the United States. And that with each 1 degree Fahrenheit of additional warming, that may contribute something like 0.13% decrease in the GDP per year. So about $33 billion per year in 2022 dollars. And we're already at sort of 1 degree-ish warming now, and we would expect to see an additional degree of warming in the next couple of decades. We're currently warming sort of between about 0.3 and 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. So what does this mean for municipalities and regions such as the MWCOG region? This includes things like an increase in borrowing costs. So the ratings agencies that help to define the credit risk are now formally incorporating climate change into their ratings. It also includes a decrease in tax revenue to municipalities, and this relates to a decrease in economic output and employment income, and so the taxable income there. It also relates to changes in property values. So overall, we're seeing a decrease in future tax revenues to municipalities. We're seeing an increase in the cost of public services, and that includes just the total volume of public services will need to increase in sort of on net to account for climate change, as well as the unit cost. So like in terms of unit cost, that's things like the increased cost of transmission, electricity transmission. That actually transmission efficiency goes down and distribution efficiency goes down as the lines warm up. That's just one example. Another example would be if there needs to be an increase in the reservoir, the freshwater reservoir capacity that's supplying a municipality, that would drive up the cost of public services. A fourth thing is increase in damage to public infrastructure. Sunny touched on a number of those things, and whether that's to transportation or energy or water or buildings, that the municipalities will be bearing that. There will tend to be a decrease in reliability of utilities, electricity and water, and a decline in public health in general. And that will also contribute to an increase in cost of public services, and particularly focused on public health, the heat consequences to health, as well as an increase in the spread of some types of infectious disease. So let's move on to the second slide and kind of scope down from the national level down to one specific case study that we worked with the city of Miami Beach on. And for the city of Miami Beach, we were articulating the business case for stormwater resilience investments. And there in the blue box, you see the elements that we looked at. So that includes expected losses and property damage, changes in property value, changes in insurance premiums, change in property tax revenues, tourism revenues, operational costs, traffic disruptions, and business closures. And looking at all of those elements, we concluded that across the city, and just focusing really on stormwater, we found that investments of at least $2 billion for the city would be cost beneficial. And then kind of like scoping down, we looked specifically at the impacts of climate change on property values. And we found that the value of property will increase by something like 4.9 to 14.1% for every foot that the nearby roads, sort of within a quarter mile of a particular property, a particular residential property, are elevated. So you elevate the property, protects it from stormwater to some extent, and it tends to increase the property value. Similarly, if you just elevate that property itself by 1 foot, it tends to increase in value by 8.5 to 11.5%. And raising roads across the city could increase the tax revenue we estimate by 6.6 million per year. So that's the kind of thing that can be done at the city level to understand what the economic costs of inaction are, as well as the benefits of action and actually addressing some of these risks. Let's go to the final slide, and this is at the individual scale. So ICF was asked by Consumer Reports to develop an analysis of what it would cost a child born this year throughout their lifetime to deal with climate change. And we concluded that the lifetime cost to a person born this year in 2024 is at least $500,000 over the course of their lifetime. And when a number of uncertain factors are included, we estimate that it will exceed $1 million. And we looked at 2 different buckets of things. We looked at effects on net income. So if you look at that right-hand blue box that's titled Lifetime Cost 2024, the left side of that is net income. The right side of that is cost of living. In the net income side, we included employment income. We included income from investments or retirement income, essentially. And we also included, it's called net income because we also included changes in taxation. And you can see that's actually the larger bucket of things in relation to the cost of living side. The cost of living side includes things like the cost of a home, the cost of electricity, the cost of transportation, the cost of food, just the things that we spend money on to stay alive and to have an enjoyable existence. And those things sum up to that somewhere between 500 and perhaps in excess of $1 million over a person's lifetime. So that's it. The last slide is just my contact information. So hopefully that is helpful in understanding sort of that continuum of cost of inaction from the national scale down to the individual level. Over. That's it for me.
Okay, thank you. And Demetra? There you go. Uh-oh. You were sharing, there you go. You're sharing screen. But I can't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. I'm so sorry. By way of introduction, Demetra McBride. I'm the Bureau Chief for the Office of Sustainability and Environmental Management, or OSEM, for Arlington County. I'm really thankful for, number one, being invited to talk on this subject, and number two, following two such great speakers with such incredible information. I actually started my foray into climate adaptation and resilience over 15 years ago in Florida and then in California, where I put it into active implementation in a project called Silicon Valley 2.0, and which informed what we did here in Arlington. Because we're a government, we wanted to be very, very specific about this triple aspect of climate action. So obviously mitigation, let's reduce greenhouse gas emissions, do no greater harm, and reverse the impacts of carbonization. And then resilience, which really formally is how quickly do you restore critical services and operations after an event. So if you lose the grid, if you lose your water supply, if the loss of the grid shuts down pump systems and et cetera. So while cities and municipalities and obviously counties are certainly clearly involved in this, our key and core partners have to be things like our major utilities and infrastructure providers like Dominion Energy here. But then, of course, this very large aspect in the middle, which is climate adaptation. How are we going to prepare? We obviously already know that the life cycle of carbon in the atmosphere is significant, up to 125 years. So we've been collecting, even as far back as the industrial age, this accumulation of carbon and pollutants in our atmosphere that are starting to create, with increases rather than decreases worldwide, it's starting to accelerate and amplify these impacts. So what are we going to do with our communities to make them inoculate them and harden them against the impacts that we simply are not going to be able to avoid? And these generally fall within physical and transition risks. Peter was really great in looking at a lot of the financial risks, and you can see credit market liquidity, insurance and reinsurance, bond rating. It was interesting to me that in California over 10 years ago, insurance and reinsurance agencies, as well as FEMA, were looking at me and laughing and saying, whoever thinks that FEMA and insurance is going to cover all this is delusional. They're not really looking at the fact that we do not have the funding to cover all of the impacts that we're going to see and all of the losses. So this adaptation, and again, Peter raised the issue of the bonding agencies, even back then, and bonding agencies just for municipalities and leaders are not just looking at what your plans are, but they're looking at your capital improvement programs and looking at your intentionality to implement those plans. This, I'm not going to go through our list. They are very, very current articles and studies. For example, this Congressional Budget Office working paper from this month, essentially, isolated just one fact on that in these direct and indirect, and there are cascading impacts. So they're going to be social, they're going to be environmental, and they're going to be economic. But this study finds, it projects that in 2024, the added cost to mortgages that are backed by Freddie and Fannie is going to be over 250 million. They project that by 2030, that figure could be closer to 400 million. And that's just in one small aspect. So the scale of these financial losses and financial peril cannot be overstated. This you've seen before from Ms. Sweeney's presentation. It's very interesting because here in our region, we're very, very consistent with this distribution of the events. And if you can look to that far, far right column, you can see that most of the losses are being caused through severe storms and through severe flooding. And that is fairly consistent with our region, where we see, at least for Arlington, our two key climate vulnerabilities going into the future, which are obviously going to be flooding and extreme heat. This is certainly not exhaustive, but it gets into that aspect of what are your climate risks. And really, if there's anything that we can encourage, is to really look at climate as not an emergency only, or how you're going to respond to an emergency, but really thinking preemptively from a strategic approach of climate risk. So you're going to have economic disruption, which Peter went through great. You're going to have the physical damage. From our first speaker, you could look at all of the impacts to roads, to anything that's made with asphalt, concrete, or steel is going to be severely stressed and is going to start breaking down or yielding at a far, far greater rate under extreme heat, and particularly extended events of extreme heat like we've just been through for 2 weeks. Health and public safety, again, Peter went through this, and even population displacement. You're talking about short-term displacement, and these are costs that are obviously going to be borne much more significantly by underserved populations. Quantifying this and really giving this a fiscal and a financial figure to it is so important because, for example, here in Arlington, as a lot of our other peers had, if you remember 2017, 16, 17, 18, and then that historic storm in 2019, there were still areas where, and in Arlington, we had areas where people had no impact whatsoever other than a typical severe storm. So you really need to quantify this because over and over and over again, we hear people saying, well, my business didn't flood or my home didn't flood. And you have to demonstrate how people are going to be affected regardless of whether they're directly flooded or not. Going through, sorry about that. Of course, I never get a call, but got a call right in the middle of this. So in Arlington, our case study, our background and our conditions and our stressors, we just basically checked down all the boxes of just about everything that could go wrong in terms of flooding. There was rapid, extensive development in this particular time period. It was prior to meaningful stormwater regulation and certainly predated the 1984 adoption of overland relief regulation. They undergrounded 2/3 of the streams, piped them, put dirt over them, and then built either on top of it or adjacent to it. So even today, just having access to the system is very, very challenging. We have poor soils, acute elevation changes. We have historic lack of easements in this rapid period of rapid development. And we have dramatically reduced physical access to the system, as I said. And then you couple all of those factors with, of course, climate-driven loading patterns and intensity of these storms. So when I arrived here in Arlington in April of 2018, the stormwater infrastructure 10-year CIPE total for 10 years, and this includes the infrastructure as well as the capital maintenance CIP totaled $11.5 million. And this is going to get to the cost of an action. So I want people to remember that figure. So we did after the historic storm and building up to that, we did a very significant pivot of the program. Again, this was influenced by Silicon Valley 2.0, which actually was a 9-sector protocol with a decision support tool. But we abandoned just looking at historic and present data. We knew that we were going to have to do projections moving forward for flood vulnerability. Take into account not just the direct, but also the indirect and the cascading impacts, and really look at that community vision that we're all thinking about regionally about what do we want to be and what do we want our communities to represent in 2050, the levels of vulnerability that need to be addressed for that vision. And then, of course, this cost of inaction, and we cannot emphasize enough, really, really looking at market trends and impacts. So this pivot, I'm not going to go through and read this, but two of the biggest things were we use the FEMA's HAZUS tool, which is the go-to tool for calculating fiscal and financial impact. But we also added onto that modified HAZUS to include environmental and social equity. We had 3 climate horizons that we studied for flood, 2040, 2070, and 2100. We clearly very early on when we saw that those projections and updated our inundation maps with future projections, we looked at blended engineering. So for example, those of you in Arlington or who may have heard about it, we have now one of the Atlantic coast's largest underground detention vaults. So blended engineering in that way. We also added on, because of these really constrained spaces and because of the legacy development, we literally went to the board and the board approved property acquisition for flood mitigation and to create overland relief for the first time in Arlington's history. Obviously, policy development, I believe it was Peter that talked about that added value of a home or structure if you just add 1 foot of elevation and go not for a base elevation, but a base flood elevation. This exercise, this 3.5 year long project, the risk assessment and management plan, which we call the RAMP, also gives both conveyance as well as storage options in each of the vulnerable areas or problem areas. And for each project, there's a cost benefit analysis. Think entrepreneurially, really look again at those market trends. And then when we started going to our board, and not just our board, but our constituency, we proposed 3 years ago a 10-year CIP for infrastructure and capital maintenance that is for the 10 years, $220 million. And that was backed decisively by the public by over 72%. This just, when you have a chance to look at it, this is to the left, this is the breakdown of the HAZIS tool and what it calculates. And then this is our modification to the right for those environmental and social impacts. And just the RAMP, and I'm going to give you the link in the last slide. So there is a lot more information. There's appendices that total over 600 pages. But you can see here with just one slide, this is a snapshot of the cost of inaction. So you can see here in your far right column, the annualized losses for a 100-year storm projected in 2070. And you can see these different watersheds that are addressed in this slide. And then when you're talking about 220 million, this is why one of the reasons why the public supported this so strongly is because you're talking about over 800 million in that annualized loss. Where you see higher numbers and higher figures, sorry, you're going to notice that this is because of where there are concentrations of commercial districts. Sorry about that. Very quickly, this is the RAMP at a glance. These documents to the left are really the main documents. And then these technical memoranda and appendices you can see listed to your right, including the market trends analysis that we designed. These are the core elements of the RAMP, which I briefly discussed. And this actually gives you the web page, which we literally recently finished this, briefed out our county manager as well as our board. And this is the RAMP page, which was just launched actually yesterday. So it's very timely. There are a couple of other pocket slides, but I know this has been provided by the COG. So if anyone has any questions, they can certainly get in touch with me.
Okay. Are there any questions? Very sobering. Any hands up that I'm missing? Okay. And now we'll go to Catherine Raynaud. Transportation Planning Board's work on the Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan, known as TRIP.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone hear me? Just thumbs up.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So good morning, almost afternoon. Thank you all for inviting me to speak to your committee today. I am Catherine, and I'm the Transportation Resilience Planner here at TVB, and I'm just going to provide a very brief overview of the project that I've been working on for about called the Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan, or the TRIP. Next slide. Next slide. Do I have the ability to change that?
Right now, you're on what is resilience slide?
Perfect. Maybe there's just a delay. So before we really get down to the brass tacks about the plan, I recognize that I'm from transportation planning arm of COG. So I'm just going to quickly review how we define resilience. And we use the federal highway definition, which is here on the slide, which is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. I am really glad that Sunny and some of the other speakers include a lot of examples of how extreme weather and climate events like heat and wind and precipitation are impacting our critical infrastructure. A lot of that was transportation infrastructure related, so I didn't include slides in my presentation on that, and I'm glad that was all covered. So we kind of all sort of tag team this together. Next slide. I'm going to talk about the newest federal program that aims to provide funding for planning and infrastructure solutions to issues of resilience in the transportation sector really quickly, because I'm not sure how familiar folks on this call are with it. So the bipartisan infrastructure law established something called the PROTECT program, which stands for Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation, which established formula funds and discretionary fund grant programs. And so the purpose of these grant programs is to plan to be more resilient to natural hazards, including climate change, sea level rise, flooding, extreme weather events, and other natural disasters. And that is through both non-competitive and competitive grants. So the PROTECT program alone offers $8.7 billion over 5 years for transportation resilience efforts. And state DOTs were on the receiving end of most of that money in formula funds, but $1.4 billion is available in competitive funds, which is the discretionary grant program. A wide range of applicants are eligible for these competitive grants, from MPOs like us, the TBB and COG, local governments, public authorities like a port authority or a tribe, or even multi-jurisdictional group of entities. There are 4 categories for these grants, which are listed here on the slide: planning activities, resilience improvements, community resilience and evacuation routes, and at-risk coastal infrastructure. Each of those categories does have a different amount of money in the pot, and the most money goes for resilience improvements. So that has, for the discretionary portion of the program, there's about $1 billion for resilient improvements, which is kind of like a infrastructure implementation project. Next slide. One of the components of the PROTECT program is this idea of a resilience improvement plan, which has the acronym of RIP. So that's why we added the word transportation to the front of ours, making it the TRIP, which just feels like a better acronym. So this optional component of the PROTECT program comes with a big benefit for agencies and localities that are implementing transportation projects to gain access to the benefits of the program by reducing the local match for a project funded by a PROTECT grant. It reduces that match by 7% if the project is prioritized in the TRIP, and a further 3% if the TRIP itself is adopted into TPB's long-range transportation plan. So what that really means is that a project funded by a PROTECT grant that normally would have to kick in 20% of the total cost may only end up having to kick in 10%, which is a huge reduction in that local match. And then one other benefit, financial benefit of including a project in the TRIP is that it does not have to include a cost benefit assessment as part of their grant application. That cost benefit assessment can be quite onerous, so that's a real big benefit as well. Next slide. Lastly, to just wrap up this brief overview of the PROTECT program, just a couple of months ago, Federal Highway did award their first round of discretionary grant funding, which sent over $830 million to 80 projects in 37 states, DC, and the Virgin Islands. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of the money was set aside for resilience improvement grants. So most of that funding did go to resilience improvement projects. And I just wanted to note here on this slide that one project in our region was awarded, and that was a planning study for recurrent flooding at Nanny Helen Burroughs Boulevard, the 295 underpass in DC, and that was a $1 million planning grant. One other thing to note is that the planning grants are funded at 100%. So there's no local match that needs to be provided. So DC asked for $1 million and they got $1 million for this project, which should be kicking off soon. And that was a joint effort between DDOT and DOEE. Next slide. So I'm going to now talk about the work that we've been doing as a region that we've been working on here at TBB. So in addition to some of the financial benefits of having an approved trip, those financial benefits aren't the only reason we embarked on this project. We really wanted to build on the strong foundation of resilience work by COG and TBB in previous years. For COG, it's probably been about 2 decades or more. So this planning effort was a great way to start our new transportation resilience planning program to both put together a document that would provide benefits for our member agencies, but also provide a foundational analysis and relationship building as a jumping off platform for the program. We also wanted to contribute to our member organizations' understanding of and planning for climate change risk and resilience. Not all of our members are in the position to complete these risk and vulnerability assessments on their own. So having one completed at a regional level provides one cohesive look at the risks our regional transportation systems face overall, but it can also be an important resource for any variety of planning purposes at the individual agency or the jurisdictional level. By completing this plan, which was mainly through that vulnerability assessment that I'll talk about in a little bit, we can get a regional picture of what areas, transportation assets, and services are most at risk. And in response, we can begin identifying priorities for investment in resilient solutions at a regional scale. And of course, there is that match reduction that comes with an approved plan should a project in our region receive a discretionary grant and is included in the prioritized project list in the plan. Next slide. That image there is just a screenshot of the cover of the final plan. So just a quick overview of how the process worked for this project. We kicked it off in April of 2023, and then our consultant completed the risk-based vulnerability assessment by the end of the summer of 2023, which we did complete in 2 phases. Phase 1 was a system level screening assessment, and then phase 2 was an asset level GIS analysis. In October of 2023, we held a regional transportation resilience forum, and an interactive mapping tool was completed towards the end of the fall, which displayed the results of the vulnerability assessment and provides members with a resource for project prioritization for inclusion in this plan. And in the beginning of 2024, we collected prioritized transportation resilience projects from our members and drafted the plan. And I am happy to say that as of yesterday, this slide is a little out of date because we have now received final approval from our division office that we have met all of the federal highway requirements for this plan and it is formally approved. I printed out the approval letter and I put it up in my office, so it's nice to look at. Next slide, please. This is just a brief summary of how we engaged and collaborated with stakeholders from across the region for this project. Regional collaboration was really important in this effort to ensure that the trip didn't conflict with other state or local plans and to improve resilience where stakeholders really most desired it. Over the course of this project, the working group has met 4 times, about once a quarter, to provide input on the methodology for the vulnerability assessment, provide feedback on resilience criteria for project inclusion, ground truth the results of the vulnerability assessment where applicable, and of course, provide feedback on the draft plan and input on next steps and priorities for future studies. In the middle of this project effort, we did hold that larger meeting dubbed the Regional Transportation Resilience Forum, which I mentioned earlier. And I just saw a couple of the working group members are on this meeting, so thank you for joining and thank you for your hard work on this project. So glad to see you guys still engaged in the topic. Next slide, please. This graphic really summarizes the main components, really the chapters that make up the final plan. The majority of what's shown here in this graphic are the federal highway requirements for a resilience improvement plan. From the context of the plan with the regional approach to resilience, and an outline of TPB's systemic approach to understanding regional transportation vulnerabilities, to the real meat of the plan, which is in the middle of the graphic, which are the main TRIP elements. We have an overview of the vulnerability assessment, both methodology and results, the priority project list of resilience projects that were submitted by members, and then a section on how we might work together as a region to actually create resilient transportation system through implementation. And the section that's along the bottom is not a required section for Federal Highway, but it was something that came along as a result of a lot of our working group meetings called Future Trip Enhancements. We kept coming up with ideas and ways that the vulnerability assessment could be more accurate, have better data, and just really be more helpful, but we just couldn't include in the scope of work for this project because of budget and time restrictions. So we included that section as sort of a list of future work we can take on at TPB to continue to inform transportation resilience planning and investments in the region. And if we have time, I have a slide at the end that kind of reviews some of the components of that. Next slide, please. So I could probably do a whole hour-long presentation on the vulnerability assessment, but I don't have an hour today. So I'm just going to give a really brief overview of the methodology and some of the results. The vulnerability assessment that we did really identified climate vulnerabilities of our region's transportation system, as well as identifying priority areas for resilience investments. The resulting mapping tool was shared with member agencies as a way to inform the resilience project list that facilitates eligibility for PROTECT funding to get that local match reduction should a project in our region be awarded funding through the PROTECT program. So here we go. Next slide, please. During the vulnerability assessment, we looked at vulnerabilities of the general transportation system asset types, which is roads and highways, bridges, public transit, active transport, and stormwater systems to each of 5 natural hazards, and those are extreme heat, inland flooding, coastal flooding, extreme winter, and extreme wind conditions. And the goal of that first phase was really to identify areas and assets of greatest risk within the region via a literature review focusing on consolidating information from existing climate studies in the region. And the second phase was choosing those asset hazard pairs that our experts and stakeholders assigned as highly sensitive during phase 1. Those moved on to phase 2 of the vulnerability assessment, where those asset hazard pairs received asset level indicator-based vulnerability assessment or literature review or map layer only. And those are shown in the matrix here. So in the dark blue are the asset hazard pairs that receive that asset level indicator-based GIS-based analysis. The light blue are those that received a literature review, and the green received sort of just a map layer on our interactive mapping tool. And that's sort of indicative of which pairs had GIS data that we could access easily and do a spatial analysis, while others were more well-suited towards just a mapping analysis or a literature review. And then those boxes that are shown in gray or white were originally marked as medium or low risk in phase 1, and we did not further analyze them due to the scope constraints of this project, but we have them out here. We can definitely analyze them in the future should we be able to expand the scope of work. Next slide, please. And for those pairs that did have available data, the asset received a risk score based on their exposure to a defined hazard and the criticality of that asset. The hazard exposure was weighted at 70% and the criticality weighted at 30%. And this bottom table just sort of shows a simple example of the scoring for extreme heat and public transit, just as a way to show how we sort of did the math there. Next slide. Since we analyzed so many transportation assets against a large variety of climate hazards, there are a lot of results, and I invite you to check those results out on the resilience mapping tool, which I will ask one of my team members to place a link to in the chat at this time. But I do have a few top line results that can help summarize the overall results from this study. So first off on this slide, you can see that the greatest number of assets, transportation assets in our region are highly vulnerable to coastal and riverine flooding. which means that they are included in the FEMA 100 or 500-year floodplain. We also included a buffer around the 500-year floodplain to catch any extreme interior temporary flooding. And then that was followed by extreme heat, and that was followed then by flooding due to sea level rise, which we used NOAA sea level rise inundation data, the 2060 intermediate high scenario. And all of this you can find in the vulnerability assessment and on the mapping tool. Next slide. We have noted that several assets did score as highly vulnerable to multiple hazards. As you can see here, we have 50 miles of road, 20 miles of rail line, and 6 bus stops scored high for more than one hazard. And I also wanted to note that all highly vulnerable assets were located within an equity emphasis area. We included a equity emphasis area as part of the criticality part of the methodology. So we wanted to make sure that we included EEA and EJ in this analysis. The screenshot on the right is just a cover page of that vulnerability assessment, which was also published as a standalone report as part of the project. But of course, the top line results were included in the plan as well. Next slide. This matrix shows some of the results that report, and it reports out the percentage of assets analyzed that were assigned high, medium, or low risk or vulnerability. So, for example, rail lines in the region have the greatest percentage of high vulnerability to any one hazard, which is 11% for coastal and riverine flooding, which is followed by roads and coastal and riverine flooding, which represents a meaningful amount of mileage of nearly 1,100 miles, or 5% of total road segments analyzed. Most assets that are vulnerable to sea level rise are also vulnerable to coastal and riverine flooding, which may increase their priority for resilience planning since they are vulnerable to multiple hazards. And then lastly on this, extreme heat was recorded to be high risk at almost 200 bus stops, or 3% of total bus stops analyzed, but far, far more have medium vulnerability, and 89% of bus stops in the region showed medium vulnerability to extreme heat. So that's definitely something that we want to focus on. Next slide. And then while this may seem obvious, the rates of vulnerability to each climate hazard varied by location widely. Again, I invite you to visit the tool online if you're interested in taking a closer look, because we think it can be helpful for decision makers to determine the vulnerabilities of specific or hyperlocal areas. And this is just a screenshot of that mapping tool with a couple of the layers turned on. Next slide. So in addition to the vulnerability assessment and the mapping tool and the plan itself, we did have several other documents created to be used as resources to both promote the plan and the program, and to provide assistance to those who may want to use it but might not know how. The first one here is something called this guidance document, which reviews some of the basics of what resiliency is, what can be considered a transportation resilience improvement project. It overviews some of the requirements of the PROTECT program, but it also includes some information on other programs, funding programs like the BRIC program. This document was originally created for inclusion to our member localities and agencies when we asked them to submit projects for inclusion in this plan, to kind of guide them through thinking through some transportation projects and understanding whether or not it could be considered a resilience improvement project or not. We just didn't want folks to sort of receive this application form for inclusion for the trip and not understand how their project might be eligible. And we also have the online mapping tool, which I talked a little bit about. And then we have a little 2-pager that kind of talks about building a resilient transportation system for the NCR, reviews a little bit about what we've been doing for the past year and a half on this plan. And then we also recently updated our website with a little bit more of this information, all the key resources on the right-hand side, So if anyone in your locality or agency has a transportation resilience improvement project and you want to submit it for inclusion in the plan, we are going to be doing an annual call for projects. So please reach out to me if you want to include that in our plan for next year. And my next and last slide, because we only have a few minutes left, I promised that I would mention some of the things that we are looking to include in the future. So as I mentioned a couple of times, we have that prioritized project list. I have a couple of slides on that, on the prioritized project list at the back of my presentation. I didn't think I'd have time to get to them today, and I was right. But if you're curious, feel free to take a look at this, download them from the COG website. And as I mentioned, we're going to be doing an annual call for projects to include so that we can update the resilience investment plan list. So in case you may be submitting or thinking about submitting a project to the Protect program in the future, it can be eligible for that 7 to 10% match reduction. We are working on some additional flooding impact analysis. One of the main things that we heard during the course of the vulnerability assessment was that FEMA floodplain data just does not really get to a lot of the urban flooding issues that we're seeing in our region. So we are working with ICF. I just kicked the project off a couple of days ago on seeing if we can't do a little bit of more analysis on understanding where we're seeing more issues of interior urban flooding and understanding what surface transportation assets might be more at risk than maybe just shown in the FEMA floodplain data. And then while we were on the topic of economic impact analysis, I'm also kicking off a new project with ICF on economic impacts of resilience work on particular transportation assets. That is starting very soon. So hopefully we'll have some asset level specific economic analysis, sort of like what we just heard about from ICF earlier on this call with like that Miami example. I do think we'll probably by the end of this coming fiscal year have some examples like that for our region for particular transportation assets. So I'm looking forward to getting started on some of those projects. Those are just sort of the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, again, if you want to switch to the next slide, that's just my contact information. I know I didn't have a lot of time today. I've been giving presentations to TBB for the past 18 months on this, so they've been primed a little bit more on some of the various aspects of this project. But if you have any questions, please take a look at our updated webpage and the mapping tool, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments or want to be included in future projects that we are working on. I'm going to be putting together a subcommittee on transportation resilience planning coming up soon here. So if you want to be included, please let me know. And I feel like now maybe we have 1 minute for questions, or we could wrap the meeting up. Thank you.
Now, if someone has questions, Demetra? Demetra?
Sorry, trying to unmute. Very quickly, I'm just curious whether anybody is the conversation opening up at all about the possibility of future retreat? And how to address that? I think for either you, Peter, or Sunny. I'm just fascinated to see if that's been part of the discussion.
For me, at this time, I'm only really looking at transportation assets. So I think retreat often is discussed when it's a little bit more with land use planning. So I want to let someone else from COG talk about that.
So on my presentation, end of the house, something that is often considered is organized retreat for certain coastal communities like Miami, looking at Alaska, parts of Washington state, where the erosion has really amplified beyond a reasonable amount and the land integrity is jeopardized. So it isn't just water incursion coming in from sea level rise, it's also the failing of the material that it's built upon. We know in North Carolina, environmental studies were sidestepped a lot with those buildings. So that's why we're seeing a lot of houses make their way into the ocean and the Carolina coastal areas. So depending on the structural integrity of the area, it is viable to maintain it versus letting it fall, because anything that we leave on the coastal areas when we do that level of abandonment does end up usually yielding into the water, because we don't have the ability to lift and pull at the same rate that we developed in the first place, especially with some of these bigger material composites, things like our nuclear power plants. It's a really good buddy up to work with some of the energy sector on the resiliency methodologies we're doing along the coastal areas, to look at what they're doing to elevate and safeguard some of those, knowing that they cannot relocate many of them.
Great, thank you.
Hey, anybody else?
Demetra McBride had a question in the chat about
Yeah. You know, we did have at the beginning of the meeting today, there was a part where we were asking people to send input about the CT letters. So this would be a great time to do that, or a great opportunity. Because yeah, the information was sobering that we got today. Cindy?
Yes, and to that end, perhaps for the next meeting, we can allot some time to discuss what this means for CEEPC work and for the work of the COG staff going forward, and whether there's a follow-up or a focus or I don't know. But we don't have time to talk about it now, and I think I've had too much data overload to really know what the key messages are yet. But I think that we shouldn't. I think there should be a follow-up to this in terms of our work on this topic. Thank you.
It seems like we need to break it down into small bites of what we can do about the different issues. I mean, just small thing on my part, I think about all our bus stops, you know, in Prince George's County, and make sure that they have covers and make sure that the seats aren't metal. Just the things that we can do on a small level to try to protect people. But if we don't have anything else right now, our time has come to an end. Our next meeting is September 25th at 10 a.m. And then the next one after that is November 20th. And if there are no objections, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Ivy. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you.